in the Great War, the First World War, than any other war in history. For instance, more men were slaughtered in the battle during the First War, the so-called war to end all wars. And why was that exact phrase coined? That in the whole of the Second World War was what seemed up until now to have been totally logical military strategy. Now makes perfect sense. If you wanted as many of your own men to be killed as possible, that strategy was that the British soldiers were ordered to walk slowly towards the German machine guns and not to charge them or take cover, resulting in horrendous damage. If they disobeyed, then they would be placed in front of a firing squad of their own comrades, so either way, they would be sure to die. Taking this as an example, it should be plain for you to see that the Illuminati have absolutely no qualms about slaughtering millions of people that they consider to be useless eaters, so neither will they have any qualms about slaughtering billions more soon. Actually, that was the format set by the Illuminati and Nathan Rothschild at the turn of the 19th century. They first maneuvered all of Europe into the Napoleonic Wars, then the Congress in Vienna, which they, and particularly Rothschild, planned to transform into a League of Nations, which was to have been the housing for one world government, exactly at the present United Nations was set up to be the housing for the forthcoming, God forbid, one world government. Anyway, that was a format the House of Rothschild and Jacob Schiff decided to employ to achieve their objective in 1914. Of course, they know that the same format had failed in 1814, but they theorized that this was only because the Tsar of Russia had torpedoed their scheme. Well, the present 1914 conspirators would eliminate that 1814 fly in the ointment. They'd make sure that after the New World War that they were conspiring there'd be no Tsar of Russia around to throw monkey wrenches into the machinery. I will go into how they accomplished this first step to launch a world war. History records a world war. One was precipitated by a trivial incident, the kind of incident both Weishaupt and Albert Pike had incorporated into their blueprints. That incident was the assassination of Australian Archduke, arranged by the Illuminati masterminds. The war followed. It involved Germany, Austria, Hungary, and their allies, and the so-called Axis powers against France, Britain, and Russia, called the Allies. Only the United States was not involved during the first 2 years. By 1917, the conspirators had achieved their primary objective. All of Europe was in a state of destitution. All the peoples were war-weary and crying for peace, and the outcome, too, was all set. It was to come as soon as the United States would be hauled in on the side of the Allies, and that was all set to happen immediately after Wilson's re-election. After that, there could be only one outcome: complete victory for the Allies. To fully confirm my statement, that long before 1970, this conspiracy headed in America by Jacob Schiff had it all set up to hurl the United States into that war. I will cite the proof. When Wilson was campaigning for re-election in 1916, his chief appeal was re-elect the man who will keep our sons out of war. But during the same campaign, the Republican Party publicly charged Wilson had long committed himself to push into the war. They charged that if he would be defeated, he would accomplish that act during his few remaining months in office. But if re-elected, he would hold off until after the election. But at that time, the American people looked upon Wilson as a God-man. Wilson was re-elected, and as per the schedule of the conspirators, he hurled us into World War in 1917. He used the sinking of the Lusitania as an excuse, a sinking which also was prearranged. Roosevelt, also a God-man in the eyes of the American people, followed the same technique in 1941 when he used the prearranged Pearl Harbor attack as his excuse for hurling us into World War II. Now, exactly as the conspirators planned, victory for the Allies would eliminate all the monarchs of the defeated nations and leave all their peoples leaderless, confused, bewildered, and perfectly conditioned for the one world government that the great conspiracy intended would follow. But there would still be an obstacle. The same obstacle that had been balked the Illuminati and Rothschilds at that Congress in Vienna, peace gathering. After the Napoleonic Wars, Russia would be on the winning side. It was in 1814, and therefore the Tsar would be securely seated on his throne. Here it is pertinent to note that Russia, under the Tsarist regime, had been the one country in which the Illuminati had never made any headway, nor had the Rothschilds ever been able to infiltrate in their banking interests. Thus, a winning Tsar would be more difficult than ever to cope with. Even if he could be enticed into a so-called League of Nations, it was a foregone conclusion that he would never, but never go for a one-world government. So before the outbreak of World War I, the conspirators had a plan to carry out Nathan Rothschild's vow of 1814 to destroy the Tsar and also murder all possible royal heirs to the throne. And it would have to be done before the close of the war. The Russian Bolsheviks would be their instruments, and in this particular plot, from the turn of the century, the chiefs of the Bolsheviks were Nikolai Lenin, Leon Trotsky, and later Joseph Stalin, of course. Those were not their true family names. Prior to the outbreak, Switzerland became their haven. Trotsky's headquarters was on the Lower East Side in New York, largely the habitat of Russian Jewish refugees. Both Lenin and Trotsky were similarly bewisped and unkept. In those days, that was a badge of Bolshevism. Both lived very well, yet neither had a regular occupation. Neither had any visible means of support, yet both always had plenty of money. All those mysteries were solved in 1917, right from the outset of the war. Strange and mysterious goings-on were taking place in New York. Night after night, Trotsky darted furtively in and out of Jacob Schiff's palace mansion, and the dead of those same nights, there were a gathering of hoodlums of New York's Lower East Side, all of them Russian refugees at Trotsky's headquarters, and all were going through some mysterious sort of training processes that was all shrouded in mystery. Nobody talked, although it did leak out that Schiff was financing all of the Trotsky's activities. Then suddenly Trotsky vanished, and so did approximately 300 of his trained hoodlums. Actually, they were on the high seas in a Schiff-chartered ship bound for a rendezvous with Lenin and his gang in Switzerland. And also on that ship was $20 million in gold. The $20 million was provided to finance the Bolsheviks' takeover of Russia. In anticipation of Trotsky's arrival, Lenin prepared to throw a party in his Switzerland hideaway. Men of the very highest places in the world were to be guests at that party. Among them were the mysterious Colonel Edward Mandell House, Woodrow Wilson's mentor and palsy Wowsy, and more important, Schiff's special and confidential messenger. Another of the expected guests was Warburg of the Warburg banking clan in Germany, who was financing the Kaiser and whom the Kaiser had rewarded by making him chief of the secret police of Germany. In addition, there were the Rothschilds of London and Paris, also Lidnop, Kanovich, and Stalin, who was then the head of a train and bank robbing gang of bandits. He was known as the Jesse James of the Urals. And here I must remind you that England and France were then long in the war with Germany, and that on February 3rd, 1917, Wilson had broken off diplomatic relations with Germany. Therefore, Warburg, Colonel House, the Rothschilds, and all those others were enemies, but of course, Switzerland was neutral ground where enemies could meet and be friends, and especially if they had some scheme